lead in battle against these creatures. And there are 11 of them. And the 12th is Kingu, who will now become her new spouse. My suspicion that these are the 12 signs of the zodiac in an early form, because one of them is a centaur, one of them is a lion, and some of them are these various creatures. And she invests Kingu, her new husband, with the tables of destiny, the maze. And that would be equivalent to the priest studying the will of the astrological cycles. So there's an intentional defamation here on the part of the Babylonians of the whole priestly worldview of these cosmic cycles in favor of the warrior mentality. We will not submit to the will of the cosmos here. We will ourselves shape it. This is the whole masculine approach to the world from out of which the West has come. The East is now fading off here. It's associated with the mother goddess and the abyss and her monstrous creations. So then Marduk says, well, I'll agree to go out and fight her if you make me king. So they have this grand affair, and they Marduk is a sun god. He is the sun. And they coronate him and have a big party. And the next day he goes out to fight Tiamat. And he thrusts a hurricane into her mouth that holds her jaws open and sends wind in that puffs her belly out, and he shoots her with an arrow, and it pops her belly open. And then he comes in and slices her in half and separates the waters above from the waters below with the two halves of her body. And from the tears of her eyes come the Tigris and the Euphrates. He makes from her breasts all the mountains, and from her flesh the solidity of the earth. Then he creates the constellations and the structure of the year, 360 days plus 5 ritual days, and all of this. And then finally, exhausted after all this, he says, well, you know what, to Ea, we need somebody to do all this for us. We need slaves. Do you have any ideas? And Ea says, well, Kingu is still alive. We'll cut him, and from his blood we'll make the race of man. So Ea goes in and does this, and from the blood of Kingu comes the race of man. They are slaves that tend the will of the gods. Man here is conceived as a slave of the will of the gods. Ea has been absorbed from an earlier Sumerian story, by the way, that actually lies behind Genesis 2. And that story is the old Claymaker story, where Ea was the creator of man. Here, Marduk is the central character because the Babylonians have moved in and taken over the Sumerian worldview, so they give Ea a secondary role. But in this earlier creation myth, Ea was with his mother, and all the crops are dying. And she says, we have to do something about this. We have to create a race who will till the fields for us. Do you have any ideas? And he says, well, I'll go to the Earth Mother. So he goes to the Earth Goddess, and he says, can I borrow some of your clay? He pulls this clay from her body, and he rolls it together and creates the first man. And everybody is so thrilled with this idea of this race of slaves who will now till the fields for the gods. They don't have to work anymore. So they throw this big party. And Ea and this Earth Goddess try to show each other up. Ea says, well, now you create some of these humans, and I will try to name for them a place in society. So she creates a man without a penis. She says, and Ea says, well, that will be the eunuch in the king's retinue. Then she creates a woman who cannot give birth. He says, that's easy. That will be in the king's harem, and so on. Then they switch roles, and Enki becomes the one who creates all of these deformed beings. And he creates them so fast and so rapidly that the Earth Goddess cannot give them names. She can't think quick enough to give them these names. And she becomes frustrated with him and kicks him out of the earthly realm, and he is exiled down into the abyss, where he becomes the lord of the abyss. And that's the creation myth, the sort of pottery myth, the clay man myth that lies behind Genesis 2, and that is beneath this Babylonian role, where the Babylonians have put Marduk, the warrior god, as primary. It's worth remarking that behind this myth, which sounds very much like a hunter stalking its prey, that the Babylonians were Semites who originally began as herders of sheep and goats, and the herders had actually taken over or were descended from the Paleolithic hunters. So they have brought a hunting mythology into the realm of herders, and the Semites have kept this hunter myth. So there is an intentional, deliberate connection between the slaying of Tiamat and these old echoes of the great mammoth hunt, from which we build out of the mammoth bones the cosmos and the slain victim. And so that is the Babylonian creation myth. And it's really the first great dragon slayer myth and the first real consolidation of the patriarchal approach to problem solving, which is the will of the hero is primary, the will of the cosmos, of which the goddess is the personification, is put down as secondary. And the priest becomes the secondary figure in this world, and the warrior becomes the primary. Well, now, this myth actually lies behind Genesis 1. The Hebrews were taken captive by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And while they were in Babylon, they heard about all of these myths, and they became kind of envious of the architectural imagination of the Babylonians. And they actually parodied the great Babylonian ziggurats in the book of Genesis as the Tower of Babel. And they come back when Cyrus the Great, the Persian, the leader of the Persian army, conquers the Babylonians and restores the Hebrews to their homeland. They come back and they rework Genesis into the account that you get when you open the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1. And God is now reimagined. The technology of the pottery craftsman is out of date now, and God is now imagined as a geometer architect who draws up the world as though he were bisecting circles with a compass. He separates the light from the darkness very neatly and systematically through 7 distinct phases, then separates the waters above from the waters below by creating a firmament, and that is the echo from the Babylonian story when Marduk cut her body in half and separated the upper from the lower. And then from out of that, he gathers all the waters together so that there's a primordial continent which he causes to sprout forth with all of this vegetation, and the air fills with these giant pterodactyl-like beings, and the waters begin to teem with these huge leviathanic sea serpents. And the word for abyss in Hebrew actually is tehom, which is the Hebrew etymological equivalent of Tiamat. So they have deliberately taken in the influences from the Babylonian myth and transformed it into a more elemental vision, where God, instead of slaying a dragon, is slaying these chaotic, unwieldy elements. But it's the same mythology. And then, almost as an afterthought, he creates Adam and Eve at the same time in Genesis 1 and places them in the center of all of this, almost like a jeweler putting the finishing touches on a cameo. And so there the technology has changed to this architect geometer. Here's the vision of the firmament. This is the Hebrew cosmos. And here's the firmament that separates the waters above from the waters below, the lower waters here. There is Sheol, the pit of hell, and the floodgates from out of which the flood comes. And that's basically Genesis 1, the cosmology of it. This is the separation motif, too. It's been abstracted from the imagery of the earlier traditions where Shu was separating Nut and Jeb. And so now we just have this sort of architectural separation, but it's still the same motif of the separation of the heavens from the earth. And so now we come to, I just briefly want to say a couple of words about Hesiod's theogony. Now you'll notice in the Babylonian vision, by the way, and the Hebrew biblical vision, that God is always personified as some kind of a technologist or a craftsman. In the earlier myths, the Egyptian creation myth and the Upanishadic myth, the world is divine itself and creates with its own energy. It doesn't require an external agent to bring it about. And I would submit that now the new scientific vision of the universe, the creation, the self-creation of the universe from the Big Bang, has more in common with the early Egyptian and Hindu myths than it does with the book of Genesis, where the God is separate from that which he creates. Briefly, before I get to the Big Bang, I just want to say a couple of words about Hesiod's vision in the theogony. Now, the Greeks had equal respect for the goddess and the god, and in the beginning, Hesiod's myth goes, there was chaos,